sociological writings and other important works, more for the philosophical system. Then here is the German ideology, the Jewish question, the economic and philosophical manuscripts, very important, only published actually in the 20th century. The thesis on Feuerbach, I mentioned the 11th, which is the most famous probably, the Grundrisse, which is a bit of the preliminary version of the Kapital that Marx hastily tried to finish because the first, arguably the first world's economic crisis was happening before his eyes in 1857, and he wanted basically not to be overtaken by reality. Then also the contribution to the critique of political economy, and then eventually the Kapital in the 1860s. Just a brief overview then of how the Marx-Engels complete works is structured. You see that many of the volumes are not those that were published during his lifetimes. Okay, so Karl Marx wrote against the background of the liberal tradition, which we learned about. And as you remember, so classical economists like Adam Smith here on the left basically told the story of the rise of capitalism and the wealth of nations as one of modern society emancipating itself, both economically and politically. Economically, by liberating itself from the Malthusian stagnation cycles, and politically as the rise of the modern bourgeoisie and democratic governance. So Marx's interpretation of the origins of this modern society is a little bit less rosy, to put it mildly. In his famous chapter on the primitive accumulation in the Kapital, here he writes that the history of this, that is also the workers' expropriation, is written in the annals of mankind in letters of blood and fire, end of quote. So Marx describes in that chapter how the very preconditions of this modern capitalism was a huge expropriation of state land, of the commons, so commonly owned land, of land that was owned by independent yeomen, so small peasant farmers. And it was only due to this primitive accumulation of capital that, first of all, there was a concentration of capital that allowed the manufacturing system to arise, but also a liberation of workers. In a way, a freedom of workers. And so Smith and Marx also disagree on how to interpret this freedom. In The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith describes, let's say, the more positive aspect of this freedom, using a negative definition of freedom as the freedom from something. So he highlights how modern workers were liberated from feudal shackles that tied them to a certain soil, that basically made certain toils and works mandatory for them, and opened them also the positive freedom to then contract, to enter just a labor contract, to earn wages, and to be mobile, right, to move around, something which in the feudal system was not necessarily the case. So Marx's interpretation of this freedom highlights more of this double sense. So quote again from the Kapital: "The free laborer free in the double sense that as a free man he can dispose of his labor power as his own commodity, and that on the other hand he has no other commodity for sale, is short of everything necessary for the realization of his labor power," end of quote. Just a footnote here, Marx refers only to men in this quote, but talking about the 19th century factory system includes women as well, and not only women, also children. So the factories that even Engels owned in Manchester regularly employed women and children with labor hours being way beyond 10 hours a day, with only Sundays off. So yeah, these terrible conditions in the 19th century concerned the entire population. End of the footnote. So what Marx wants to highlight in this quote is that he grants this emancipatory narrative that the modern workers are free in the sense that they are mobile, that they are not tied to the soil, that they don't have to work for the landlord anymore. But he also highlights that in a way, this liberation deprives them from the ownership of land or the ownership of tools that they had in previous times, and that the dependency, these feudal shackles, had, let's say, a new form, which now is the labor contract, which is usually not resulting from a symmetric negotiation between workers and the owners of the means of productions, or the capitalists. You may also recall from the lecture on liberalism that Adam Smith and his followers, like David Ricardo, saw the division of labor as the main driver of economic growth. And Marx's main critique of this is to say that the main driver is not necessarily this very functional division of labor, but it is the way that labor is organized in capitalism. And in capitalism, it's organized in an alienated form, where it is the expropriation of what Marx terms the surplus labor, we will get to that, that produces this surplus wealth, which is reflected then in the wealth of nation. Then you may recall that the liberal utopia also saw this national wealth as trickling down to all strata of society. Basically, the rising tide lifts all the boats as a philosophy, where there is still inequality in an absolute sense, but relatively speaking, it is less, let's say, terrible inequality when compared to the feudal system, or pre-modern kind of societies. Marx strongly opposes this liberal utopia by pointing to what is often referred to as the immiseration hypothesis, namely a growing trend of, well, on the one hand, capital to concentrate, but also the working classes to fall into ever more misery. And instead of a utopia, Marx observes already during his lifetimes, with the 1857 first global financial crisis, with its origins in a New York banking crisis. So he observes a recurrent and even severing economic crises tendency. So whereas liberals then, if you want to use a more modern term, already see the end of history approaching, with sort of capitalist democracies being the end, Marx rather sees this as a stage, and also necessary stage towards an eventual new system called communism. Liberals also, we saw that, use that metaphor of the invisible hand of the market that miraculously transforms individual vice into public virtue. Marx opposes also this somehow intransparent explanation of the wealth of nations, by saying that it's an open class struggle that is happening, and that is the driver also of history, with intentions of collective actors. So the labor movement, obviously against capitalists of various brands, financial capitalists, landed capitalists, industrial capitalists, and their struggles being the most important visible hand, right, that shapes market relations. Basically a strong opposition of Karl Marx against all of these main proposals of the liberal tradition. I wanted to get at what I think is a very important element in both the early and late writings of Karl Marx, and which is a little bit neglected in usual lectures on Karl Marx, which is the idealist model of action, it may be called, which Marx then transforms into a material model of action. So for this, we go back a little bit to Hegel and his idea of how history evolves. And we start in a very micro perspective now, starting with an individual conscience, yeah? So here is an individual conscience. Think about it as an individual actor. Who becomes active, yeah? So he or she intends to do something, yeah? Or in abstract terms, I intend to do P, yeah? To P, I intend P. Which may be, yeah, I intend to produce, for instance, a piece of furniture. In this process, then, this intention is realized. In other terms, you could also say that it is objectified. So this intention is then eventually objectified in an object. So that if you want, a part of me that is the intention, continues to live, but outside of me in a given object. This may simply be a statement that I say, and this is more of the Hegelian model. It can simply be a material object. So let's stay with the immaterial object. So I produce a certain statement or a collection of statements, like a novel. Yeah? In that novel, I realize part of myself. Yeah? Once I produce that novel, I can sort of see myself in the novel. Yeah, I can reappropriate myself, that objectivized self in the novel, and accept a thing which is outside of me as mine. Yeah, and I might even learn something about this in the process, right? So you probably know this experience when you write something down and you read over it on the next day. There's something starting to evolve in you, right? A certain learning process. In Hegelian terms, this then could be referred to as, so my original intention P, yeah, becomes realized as a my P, yeah, and then through me observing and reappropriating it, it becomes recognized again as a P, but probably a new P, because it underwent a very complex process of being objectivized and reappropriated. So in a way, this me observing the final product of my labor, this novel that I wrote, yeah, gets me a knowledge about this novel which contains more than my original intention to write the novel. And in a way, this is a dialectical, Hegel would say, enriching kind of relationship, where in a way I know something like a P square at the end. Yeah? So this sounds a little bit abstract, but I think it becomes quite palpable once you think about how we learn, like learning processes in education, or also how artists work and